For over 80 years, men of the World War II generation have been celebrated as the greatest generation, having an uncommon level of determination and courage that sustained them through World War II, and these descriptors also apply to those who were on the home front during the war. How much of this narrative is truth versus a mythology of America that had told itself during the Cold War? And while many of the soldiers were great, they were all ordinary men sharing in all of humanity's weaknesses and flaws while responding to the call of duty. To explore this question and also look into a number of stories of those who served in World War II is Andrew Biggio, today's guest, who's the author of The Rifle 2, Back to the Battlefield. Andrew joined us a few years ago with his book, The Rifle, where he personally met a number of World War II veterans. He returns with more stories of firsthand accounts from the last of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who fought the largest war in history. This idea came about when he began traveling across the country with a 1945 M1 Garand, the basic U.S. fighting rifle of World War II. He asked combat veterans of that war to sign it, and as touching that rifle evoked a flood of memories, asked for their stories. In this episode, we're going to see how grasping that rifle brings out memories of that war, whether good, bad, terrifying, or heroic. Hope you enjoyed this discussion with Andrew Biggio. We have a lot to discuss here, individual stories, large thematic issues about war, and how some things that exist in war are not just specific to a particular battle, but have always been with us. But before we get into all that, could you give listeners a little bit of background who don't know about your first book, The Rifle? Can you tell us about that book and what prompted you to write it?
Yeah, I mean, The Rifle Volume 1, what prompted me to write it was I was a war veteran myself who came home asking about the price of war. And because I was named after my uncle who was killed in World War II, I wanted to know more about this young Andrew Biggio who didn't get to make it home, who died at age 19. And I got to survive my wars and live my life, but he became one of the many names that this country seems to forget who laid down their life in combat. So when I read his letter home, how much he enjoyed the M1 rifle, I went out and purchased an M1 rifle because I wanted to hold what he held and feel what he felt. And I thought who else would understand it more? So I started bringing the rifle to these World War II veterans and seeing their reaction and the way they acted, holding it again, and kind of how it acted as a microphone. I ended up collecting over 320 stories, and each veteran signed my rifle. So now it's covered in 320 names and 320 legacies. And I had to put pen to paper for some of these stories that I was hearing, and that's what spawned the book, The Rifle.
I always imagine when they touch it that muscle memory kicks in. They might be slumped over because they're in their 90s, but suddenly their posture gets erect. They sit upright, maybe they sight it. This is what I'm imagining, but were there any moments like that where they seemed to flash back into their 20-year-old selves?
Almost all of them. Every one of them that was hunched over, weak, somehow had the boost of energy to raise it. I mean, guys who can barely hold their cane are all of a sudden, gripping this rifle again and raising it to their shoulder. It was really fascinating what this piece of weaponry, what this instrument does to them at their age, which is the average age is 100 now.
Something that you got to see is huge cross-section of soldiers. So you're not just talking to a couple of people. And for many people who have a personal connection to World War II, a lot of time it's baby boomer age people who have fathers or uncles who fought in the war. But you got to talk to dozens, if not hundreds of vets, and you got to see cross-sections and aggregates and all sorts of other things. As a veteran yourself, what was your perception of World War II vets before you began talking to all of them? Maybe you had stories from when you were in the service. And then what was your more nuanced perception after you had talked to so many of them?
Well, I think, and this is initially going into my military service and getting out and becoming a brand new veteran. I think a lot of people agree who wore the uniform that the World War II veterans are the GOATs, right? They're the greatest of all time. They're the greatest generation. All hail the World War II veterans. Like, we literally part the seas if we see them. We thank them for the service because of the hell they went through, because of the casualties they took, and because of the world they saved. It seemed to be always portrayed, it was the good war, the good versus evil. And it was kind of black and white back then of the way it was supposed to be. But then meeting these veterans, over 320, I started to learn that war wasn't just black and white, and that the greatest generation did some not so great things to win World War II, stuff that would put our troops today in jail or would be considered war crimes. And, I think it was probably Joe Drago the first veteran that ever signed the rifle that really opened my eyes. And I felt like I didn't have to live in the shadows of World War II veterans because my wars weren't as good or as necessary. But, when he talked about the Battle of Okinawa and the civilians that got killed and what being able to shoot at anything that moved and relax, don't enough with that greatest generation crap, is what he would say. It really was the best therapy I ever had. It really opened my eyes to see, like, I'll never forget, and I think I mentioned it on your first story, like, he thought the Marines urinating on dead Taliban in 2011 was like a joke compared to what they used to do to the enemy. And he gave me the real deal, the real raw deal. And after he signed my rifle, being the first one, I wanted to go and get as many stories as possible. And I did that. And I learned that these guys, were sent over there with little training. Today's soldiers have way more training or learn, spend months learning how not to kill civilians. And back then it was just, you see a target in a B-17, then drop every single bomb. It doesn't matter what's next to it, So there was a lot of learning about that. And I still, of course, respect the living hell out of World War II veterans, and they are my heroes. I got to meet all my heroes and all the guys I wrote about. But at the end of the day, the world's always been great. According to Maury Bishaff, who served in the 104th Division, who's 98 now, and he said, what? We always say, we turn on TV and say, oh, the world's gone crazy. He's like, to be honest, it's always been crazy. This is a guy who's seen the Great Depression, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the 9/11, all up till today.
What prompted you to write a follow-up? Because when you released the first volume, now it's out there. There are other people who come along and say, oh, I have a story too, or I have an uncle. I know someone else who has something that he wants to bring, and the book takes on a life of its own. What did this process look like that wanted you to do the volume 2?
Well, first of all, the demand. I mean, people wanted a part 2. People were messaging me, hey, you're doing a second book. You're getting more signatures. You must be getting more stories. And I was. And there were stories that didn't make the first book. So, yeah, I was still, I made myself a goal. Like, let me hit it in, an even number. Let me get 300 names on the rifle. I'm at 243 right now. Let's get to 300. And then, I was getting more great stories. While I was on my book tour for the first book, The Rifle, I was meeting more World War II veterans who were attending my book signings, who were coming to the local American Legion or VFW posts around the country because they were invited, and they had a remarkable story to tell. So I started meeting more amazing individuals, including Ed Cottrell, who 102 years old fighter pilot. I got to tell his story called Our Mary because that was the name of his P-47. And, he drove himself to my book signing in North Carolina. I never met him before. And so it was stories like that I said, oh, man, I got to do a volume 2. But in doing volume 2, I didn't want to make another honky-dory Greatest Generation World War II book. With my first book, I defined the lines that I wanted to do to make my book different than the millions of other World War II books already written. I interjected a little bit of myself, a little bit of my experience in the Marines, and I introduced the youngest generation saying goodbye to the oldest generation of veterans in the country. That's never been done a lot, if not ever. So that's what made my first book different than the tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of other World War II books already written. So I had to do it again. Here I am getting ready to put pen to paper, write a second book about World War II. Okay, Andy, how are you going to make this different than every book that gets opened? That's the flag raising on Iwo Jima, the Battle of the Bulge, and jumping into D-Day. Well, I said, why don't I cover some veterans who came home and they sucked at life, and they still made it to the finish line. They still made it to 98, 99 years old. But let's talk about guys who hit speed bumps. Let's talk about guys who ended up in prison. Let's talk about guys who were alcoholics. Let's talk about guys who were complete liars, because I met them all. And, I'm at the point now, like, I'm on my 14th trip overseas, bringing World War II veterans overseas to show them where they fought, and them showing me where they fought. And, I had a son of a World War II veteran pull me aside, and, I'm not going to say his name, but he said, hey, I just want to let you know that I didn't talk to my father for 10 years. He was awful. He was an alcoholic. He beat me, he beat my mom. He threw the sofa out our second story window of our home. And he was just a nasty person. And, I didn't talk to him until he got clean and sober. And I said, wow, that's amazing. This is stuff you don't hear about the greatest generation. And I said, why don't I change the names, of course, to protect people's privacy. But why don't I start talking about these stories? And that's kind of how I differed Rifle 2.
That must have been a hard sell in the publishing world that knows its largest buying cohort are baby boomers who want those Band of Brothers stories and the Greatest Generation sepia tone filter put over these things. But it does take away this human element. And don't worry, listeners, we are going to get to the hero stories, I promise. But I say that because this is a natural way to seg to when you're talking to veterans, you're interviewing people between the ages of 96 and 104, and their memory isn't as strong as it was decades earlier, but sometimes you'll ask them questions like, what division are you in? That if you serve, forgetting that would be like forgetting your own name. No matter how bad your memory is, if you can speak, you'd probably be able to remember that. So you'll hear things, they'll cross-reference their stories with division histories, historical documents, other publicly available data. And were there times when you would hear a story, maybe something just didn't quite sound right, and you go and look it up and it doesn't match? And can you talk about those types of events?
Yeah, and it started happening, and I was naive and gullible and, learned the hard way. Basically, when the rifle project started to become popular on social media, people started dropping in my inbox. Hey, my neighbor was in the Battle of the Bulge. Hey, my grandfather was with Patton. These are all requests and messages that came to me. And I would fly out of my house with the rifle and go meet this individual without doing any background. It started, like they signed their name on the rifle. And then I would ask them, oh, what unit were you with? And they're like, can't even answer me. And I'm like, oh, great. And now this guy just marked up my rifle, took a spot from someone else. And I find out they end up being like 4 or 5 years way too young for World War II, but they're still telling people they're World War II veterans. I talked about one time I drove like 4 hours to northern Maine to meet this gentleman. And, his grandkids told me he was a B-17 ball turret gunner and that he, shot down Messerschmitts and all sorts of stuff. And I get up there and the whole family, all the grandkids and the kids are all in the living room, wrapped in a semicircle. And they're all excited to hear Grandpa talk about the war and that this guy with this rifle is going to have Grandpa sign it. And of course, Grandpa talks about, being a B-17 ball turret gunner and, shooting this one down, shooting that one down, and D-Day. And on D-Day, you could see the parachutes on the ground from from his ball turret. And then, of course, the Army Air Corps back then was one of the most best kept records of all branches. They had the best kept records. They put out every flight log, every name of a plane, where a plane was shot down, what their bombing target run, who was on that plane, what squadron they were in, where they were in formation. If other B-17s saw another B-17 get shot down, they would have to take notes of where it was shot down. They did eyewitness accounts. And, I couldn't find this guy on this, 493rd, bomb group, let's just say his roster anywhere on any of the flight logs from 1944 or 1945. And then finally, I found a document that, gave thanks to all the mechanics back in England, and he was on that list. He was a mechanic, which is like super important to be fixing these B-17s that get shot up or hit with flak or make sure they're ready for a 13-hour trip on a bombing run. And so he never left England. He repaired B-17s, but he had been telling his family for 75 years that he was this crazy war hero, And would I have driven 4 hours to get his signature on the rifle? Maybe not. But if he lived locally towards me, I'd absolutely go and get his name on the rifle because he's a World War II veteran, And, I just didn't. Now that I was an author and I'm a historian and I am, when you lie to me, you're going to destroy my credibility. Because if I start to promote who you are incorrectly, I lose credibility.
That must be a universal thing, stolen valor. My brother-in-law, who's in the Air Force, has had cases where he'll talk to a guy who claims he's a vet and he'll ask him, oh, what's your AFSC, your Air Force Specialty Code? Which, that's something you could tell to a Chinese spy if you want to. It's something that's completely out there. And the person was like, oh, I can't tell you, it's classified. Oh, okay, sure. And sometimes it truly is dark and nefarious. Sometimes it's just sad or people are confused. The most, I guess you could call it funniest story of stolen valor I ever encountered was my wife and I volunteered one time at this Thanksgiving homeless shelter thing about 15 years ago. And this guy was saying, oh, I have a grandfather who was in special forces in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and Gulf War. And I did the math in my head. I thought, yeah, of course, they're going to send a 70-year-old man in special forces behind enemy lines. It's, if you just stop to think about it for 1 second, it doesn't add up.
Yeah, it's a little ridiculous. I've had people when I worked in veteran services who would say, oh, I don't have a DD-214 because I was black ops. And it's that the fact that I jumped in Grenada is not on there. It's like, give it a rest.
Yeah, it's a little convenient. Well, with positive stories, one thing at the beginning of your book is you didn't have a vet in Volume 1 who fought in the Pacific Theater at Peleliu, which is where Eugene Sledge, who's the central character of the HBO series The Pacific, fought in. And for anyone who knows World War II history in the Pacific, I mean, that's just some of the hardest, most intense fighting. But you did for Volume 2 with Emilio Maglacane. Can you tell me about his story? Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors.
Emilio was a hidden gem. I mean, he was 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Able Company. And if you watch Band of Brothers or read With the Old Breed, you'll know that Eugene Sledge was 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, K Company. So I wasn't going to get a closer representation of what it was like on Peleliu than that right now in the year 2022 or 2021 when I first met Emilio. And it was just incredible, and the things that he told me, you couldn't even make up of what the fighting was like in Peleliu. Flamethrowers, hand-to-hand combat, an enemy that wouldn't surrender, the macabre things of collecting, of course, human trophies and stuff like that went on there, and how this guy could have lived a normal life after World War II. And, of course, I interviewed his kids. I met his kids who've become friends of mine. What this guy had to see and what had to endure was just unbelievable. It was unmatched compared to what I hear in Europe, having to shoot an enemy combatant so your buddy doesn't light him up with the flamethrower because you don't want to hear the guy scream and get burned to death. So you shoot him, and then you shoot another enemy combatant who's dying because you don't want your other buddy to bayonet him because they've been bayoneting guys, and it's just, stuff like that is just stuff that I never really heard a lot of in the European theater. And, him talking about, when the Japanese bodies would bloat up, guys would run and jump on them. And it was a fun activity called burping, where they would let out this big, nasty burp if you jumped on their carcass. This is stuff that is just unmatched compared to, the European theater.
With people like that, those who fought in really intense combat, you talk to their families also. What did talking to their family members do to add more color to their story?
Well, because I was secretly wanting to know if they would ever take out their stresses on their family, or if they had nightmares, and and why they refused to ever go back to places like Italy or the Netherlands or Paris or France or Rome or, Holland, Germany. Did they just avoid it at all costs? Did they have reunions? Did your dad ever talk about it? That's all the stuff I wanted to know. That was part of the story. Because, it's a Vietnam vet taught me, you are not what you perceive to be when in an interview. Like, you can give your perception of who you think you are, but really it's what other people think is what you really are. And that's why it was important to get 2 cents from the families too.
There is somebody in your book that you introduce in the beginning, his name is Mike Linquanta, that his senior year in high school is cut in half in 1944. And that's not something I had ever really thought of before. What happens to those 18-year-olds who are in high school when the war is going on, when every military-age man is being funneled to the war effort? And you hear all the stories of the 18, 19-year-olds after Pearl Harbor, they run to the recruitment office the next day. But when the war is going on and they think, okay, very clearly I'm going to be enlisted, and at the early part of your senior year, you're 18. So when does that come about? And you describe it. So can you describe how that happens and how Mike's specific story plays out?
Yeah, so the high school class of 1944 nationwide had the ability to graduate early. They could be done at Christmas time. So they'd go to school for a few months. That was their senior year, especially if they were joining the military. and some others would wait around to be drafted. But if they were joining, they could graduate early. And a lot of people did that, including my uncle, who was killed in action. So Mike Linquata was from Gloucester, Mass, and joined up, went Christmas, it was 1940. He would have graduated in 44. So they graduated him early in 1943. So he goes and becomes a medic with the 35th Infantry Division. And in the Battle of the Bulge, this guy has to, they get completely surrounded. They're getting overrun. And he's left with 30 wounded to babysit. And instead of them freezing to death or getting killed, this 19-year-old takes it in his own hands and surrenders them. Walks right into the German lines, through bodies, through tree bursts, through everything with a white flag, and surrenders all these men who were wounded, and ultimately saves their life, because now the German medics treated them. They went to a prisoner of war camp. They didn't freeze to death. And he was never, in my opinion, properly recognized for that. That deserved a Silver Star, but and then of course, doing that, he then sacrificed, he could have screwed. Instead, he sacrificed himself and had to go to a prisoner of war camp for 6 months and starve, 90 pounds when he's liberated, because he saved all those men that were wounded.
Another one who has, I don't know if I want to call it mishap, but challenges like that in the war is Ted Smith, who's a P-47 fighter pilot that crashes into German soil on January 1st, 1945. What's his story?
Yeah, Ted was the roommate of Ed Cottrell, who I wrote about, and he died in the Battle of the Bulge. Ed lost 2 roommates during this. As a pilot, officers would have roommates, other wingmen. And Ed came home to 2 empty beds in his schoolhouse in Belgium, because both of his buddies were shot down. And I took Ed Cottrell back to Belgium for the first time in 77 years. I located Ted Smith's grave in Holland. He buried at Mauergraten Cemetery. I didn't tell Ed that I had found it. And I let Ed walk down the aisle of the row, on his own. And he broke down. He broke down crying on 2 knees and grabbed the grave and started to cry. And it was a scene right out of Saving Private Ryan, and watching this 100-year-old man get down on 2 knees to see a name written in stone that he hadn't seen ever. And we had got some information, because the Germans, especially the SS, were good at record keeping. So we got the exact location of where Ted Smith went down, and we went to the crash site. And there's a farmer that had been farming there for over 30 years. And every time his tractor would kick up pieces of Ted's plane, he collected it. So we were able to present Ed Cottrell the compass from Ted Smith's plane with the serial number in it, of that serial number, matching serial numbers of the plane.
One group of people who usually don't get their stories told are those who aren't excited about fighting the war. Maybe they come from a pacifist background, but they're not conscientious objectors. They're not the people who are running off to the recruiting office. And one interesting person is Charles Ketchman. Your chapter about him is called The Pacifist. And he's hesitant to pick up the rifle, which isn't common when you're talking to all of these vets. What's his story, and what was his life like after the war?
Yeah, Charlie Ketchum, who just passed away, actually. So he didn't get to see the finished product of his book. I think about him a lot, because I really wanted to bring him back to Trier, Germany, and he really wanted to too, but his health was starting to fail. He came back to Lexington, Massachusetts, and he vowed to never pick up a gun again. And when I showed him the rifle, he was very proud of me, very admirable, but he promised to never pick up another gun again. So he just signed it, and that was it, and just looked at it. And, during World War II, he served with the 10th Armored Division, 54th Armored Infantry, through their blitz through Germany. And he shared a very powerful moment with me, where he came across the woods, and a German had his guts hanging out and was begging him to shoot him. And that stuck with him his whole life, of that German kid, in, speaking in German for him to shoot him, pulling the barrel of his gun to his head, all sorts of stuff. And Charlie couldn't do it. And it really bothered him, because he said if he could go back in time, that he would have shot him and changed and ended his pain and suffering. And that stuck with him for a long time. And so after that, he never carried it or touched another firearm.
There are stories in any war of desertion or faking injuries or causing self-harm to get off the front lines. And for people not in the battle, it's easy to say, well, that's cowardice, that's not leaving the mission, etc. And war is complicated. That can be an element, but there could be people that maybe they have incredible responsibilities at home. They think of their families falling apart if they die. They have all sorts of complexities in what their loyalty is. And maybe they had a terrible experience in the war. They've been asked to do things that violate their conscience. With that all in mind, you come across stories like this as well in your book as you're talking to these veterans. And could you tell me some of those stories?
Yeah, especially the Italy campaign, they started to become really unmotivated. They knew that progress was being made in the advancement across France and into Germany, across the Rhine River. And these guys are still stuck going up these hills in Italy, going up these mountains in Italy with guns pointing right down at them with artillery raining on them. And they couldn't figure out why the hell that they had to be cannon fodder in Italy. They were looking at the headlines in the newspapers. They were seeing how good progress was being made. And they could see the progress the Russians were making. And they were like, why did they keep these 5, 6, 7 divisions here? And, General Mark Clark would always say, well, it's to keep, the 30 German divisions stuck in Italy so that they don't go reinforce the Western or Eastern fronts. But it started to get to the point where these guys felt like they were on suicide missions going up these hills, and this is where I heard a lot of stories of mutiny and guys walking off and guys faking injuries because here, you survived Anzio, you survived Monte Cassino, you survived the fighting in and around Rome. And now here you are again, going up this muddy hill where it looks like the Germans took chainsaws to all the trees. So there's nowhere to hide. And yet they're literally knocking on Hitler's door, but you're still fighting these guys in Italy, So I heard a lot of stories like that come out of the Italy campaign. And of course, it's one of the most least, theatrical silver screen, for history purposes. There is no mini series that covers the Italy. There's not a lot of movies that cover what it was really like in Italy. So it takes a lot of reading to understand what really happened there. It was like damn near Vietnam style fighting of going up hills and stuff like that into the enemy's guns.
I remember that account from Audie Murphy where he was able to do well here, but he could basically run at full speed, bent at his back. So he's holding his gun to the bottom of the ground, but somehow he can run fast. And he's also really little, so maybe that makes him work well in an environment like this. But it doesn't sound like a really impressive way to fight. What would that look like it wouldn't look very cinematic seeing it. Hearing about it is one thing, seeing it is another. So yeah, whole different sides of the war would normally think about. One point you made that stuck out to me too was that you would encounter people who made the war effort possible, who were doing normal things. They were driving trucks, they were peeling potatoes, and you would have the rifle and they'd say, oh, are you sure you want me to sign that? And they've probably gone through this their entire life. They at least have the decency to be honest about what they did, but they weren't on the front lines. They weren't storming Normandy. They were doing the normal things that an army needs to be done to fight. And what was it like talking to these men and them recollecting on their experience in the war?
Yeah, I have cooks on the rifle. I have truck drivers on the rifle. I have supply clerks on the rifle. I wanted to represent the whole war on the rifle, and I appreciate their honesty. And what's funny is that, some of these men who were just a clerk or just a supply or a truck driver, I have some remarkable experiences with them when I bring them overseas, There's something about, I could take an infantry guy who got wounded twice back to a field of battle in Belgium and say, wow, this is where you were. Yeah, it doesn't look like it used to. Or, sometimes I take a supply guy who finds a house and says, this is where we used to keep all the medical supplies. This is where, and we knock on the door and the family inside the house that says, yeah, I remember when the Americans were here and they kicked my grandparents out and come on in, let's have beer together. That's what's remarkable. Everyone has a story to tell. Everyone has a special experience. And sometimes it's not a guy who saw extreme amounts of combat that can tell that story and have that, teach that lesson to the younger veterans.
Scott here. One more break for a word from our sponsors. We'll look at the recollection of how these different veterans made sense of the war in their lives 70, 75, nearly 80 years after the fact. But are there any other particular stories that really stick out to you when you were talking to them?
Oh, yeah. You can tell some people when they get dementia or senile that they're not going to be a good interview, but it's good just to get their signature, preserve their legacy, look at their DD-214, who they were, check them off the list of trying to represent the whole war on the rifle. But there are guys who their memory is just as good as it was when they were 50 years old, even though they're in their 90s. I mean, these guys are freaks of nature. I mean, they are. You know, sometimes I hear little smart-ass remarks from other historians or authors, and like, you know, they never say it directly to me, but I hear them in other interviews where like, oh yeah, I was interviewing World War II veterans when they knew what they were talking about and when they were young and had their memory. And well, I'm meeting guys with memories that is amazing, and that when I bring them back to Europe, they know even more, you know. And so obviously I'm not going to waste my time with guys who can't remember jack, but I still, even if it's one quote from that veteran, one display of excitement or muscle memory, these are the things that are going viral on social media. The guy can have full-blown dementia, but if I put the rifle in his hands and he's smiling and he talks about a 1-second quote from the war or 1-second memory of training, that'll go more viral than the guy that knows everything. So that's been my experience with it.
I think this raises maybe the most interesting thing about your book is that you're talking to men who are in their 90s, early hundreds. And some might think, well, their memory aren't as sharp, so it'd be better to pick up a book written from the 60s to the 90s with these World War II recollections back when they were younger, middle-aged men, their memory's sharp, they can relate things better. But you highlight here that history, when it's produced, it's often, or sometimes more so, about the time that it's recorded rather than what people are recollecting. So people who are talking about what happened in the 40s, they're talking about their memories, but they're also framing it in light of what's going on in their lives now, and they're making sense of it. So if you talk to them in the 60s or 70s, their fathers, they're talking about the war in terms of what they want to teach their young children. If it's in the 80s or 90s, now they're retirees, they're talking about the next generation. Here, you're talking to men at the end of their lives. They know the end is near. They're talking about the war, but also in a grand scheme of what they think their lives meant, and they know that they're passing things on, and they're thinking about the future in that sense. So with that in mind, what was your sense of these accounts, knowing that the end is near?
I felt like a lot of them didn't want to die with secrets. And one guy that changed my life on why I should tell these stories was, he was in book one, but it really was Clarence Cormier. And all his kids knew, his direct children, all they knew his dad was a POW. That's all they knew. And when he recounted and he was crying his eyes out telling me this at age 95, you know, of the Germans putting him into a boxcar train, and that train heading to Germany, but 2 American P-47s see this German train, they start strafing it and over again. Little do they know they're killing their own prisoners, their own POWs, their own American soldiers. The Germans let them out of the train, and having to lay on the ground and form the letters POW with their human body so the planes could see them on their third dive in and finally bail out after the massacre. And he cried. It was the first time I ever saw a 95-year-old man cry, and it made me feel so taken back to see a man who, you know, lived through his spouse passing away, raised a family, had careers, probably had lots of ups and downs, but then crying his eyes out to a 30-year-old who's at his house with a rifle. And it's, to me, that's a story. And his daughter grabbing me in the hallway saying, wow, I always knew my dad was a POW, but I've never heard him tell that story, right? So when he was his sharpest in the 1980s and 70s, he didn't tell that story. But now he is when he's 95. So there's some beneficial things to them for being this age and then wanting to talk.
Yeah, at this point, there's no reason not to hold back anymore and really see what they were thinking and feeling all these decades. Well, as we discussed here on this episode, we really see war in all of its courage, but also its ugliness as well. And this is true in any war that people have fought in, whether Vietnam, World War II, what we hold up as the greatest generation, had just as many challenges with it as any other battle in history. And for listeners who want to check this out, the name of Andrew's book is The Rifle Volume 2, Back to the Battlefield. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I loved it.